What's up, guys and gals of the sporting world? It's Shawn Myszka, the Movement Miyagi, coming to you with a special topic today. Something that I want to briefly unpack, something that I'm very passionate about. This idea of a movement and skill acquisition specialist that I believe that could occupy space and represent a true shifting of a paradigm within professional sports here in the United States. I believe that right now is the ripe opportunity for the inclusion of such a role and position. And I believe that they would represent the next frontier of guiding and channeling and facilitating more skillful movement behavior for the athletes that we work with in and across professional sports here in America. And I'm going to get into why I believe so strongly in this idea, maybe what gaps or weaknesses in the current landscape this type of position could occupy and fill, and why I believe that anyone that might be listening out there that would exist in the NFL and Major League Baseball and the National Basketball Association and the National Hockey League, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, pretty much any and everywhere that we can see professional sporting organizations occupying this type of position. I believe that those decision makers should begin to look at this a little bit more seriously. Now, I've been talking about this for over a decade at Football Beyond the Stats, my blog, and it's this idea that has evolved over time. But I've had certain calls to action. I've shouted from the rooftops and banged the drum for anyone that will listen that I believe that this type of role, a movement and skill acquisition coach, and really that role can be deemed in any way someone would see fit. I started off calling it a movement coach, much of like how my career began to take off working with NFL players and partnering alongside of them. But now I believe that this position could be more encompassing, all encompassing, one that is more integrative and one that is highly collaborative. And we're going to get into some of those things. But I would point you to these blog posts where you can sort of see that evolution as well. My evolution from being a purely movement coach to now somebody who views movement behavior in a totally different way. And so the evolution of the movement coach idea has sort of been tested and audited now on an individual and personal level with 10 to 12 NFL players each and every given season. But I believe that if someone in professional sports were to really take this idea, harness it, and allow it to flourish within their organization, it can truly change the landscape, truly change the game, and change their respective sport. Typically, when we think about movement, we think about motor actions, right? And that would have been the old Shawn Myszka, the one that you see back indoors at the facility, looking from off to the side and staring back at the athlete, telling them how it is that they needed to behave, where we were chasing rote repetition and perfect practice made perfect, or so I thought, and so many still think. But once I started to have some of those moments where my own snow globe had begun to be shooken up a bit, I started to see that it was really more about this adaptive and functional relationship between an athlete and their environment. And that to me is what began to characterize skill. And so this idea of this adaptive and functional relationship from Keith David's Eduardo Ruggiero of ecological dynamics framework, we can start to really look at maybe what this position could offer in and across the American professional sporting landscape. It's one where we can really study those relations and those interactions more deeply. And even though some within sport might say or perceive that they are already doing that, I believe that we must look deeper and have the ability to zoom in at certain times and zoom out and have this exchange about how players are truly solving problems in their sport. So the evolution of the movement coach idea has sort of come along for the ride with me in my career. But at the heart of sport is something that Dr. Mel Siff and Dr. Yuri Koshansky stated back in Super Training, the old athletic performance training Bible that is Super Training, that sport is nothing but a problem-solving activity where movements are used to produce the necessary solutions. And so how a performer, how a player, how an athlete coordinates, controls, and organizes those movements become of vital importance to us. And again, it's not just about the motor actions themselves, but it's about those individuals solving the problems within their world, their perceptions, and what they're seeing, what they're sensing, what they're picking up from information within the world that would serve to channel and guide their respective movements, their cognitions and their intentions and their decision making, the decisions that they make and how they might carry them out is something that's of vital importance to us. And then finally, intertwined and interwoven, integrated with those perceptions and cognitions would be one's movement or motor actions, their strategies and how it's being coordinated and controlled to be adapted to fit the needs of the problems that they're facing in their world. And luckily, some individuals across the world, particularly in other countries and internationally, are beginning to see where this type of role might be able to have an impact and influence on their entire sporting landscape. Just a month or so ago, the Western Australian Institute of Sport actually publicized this role, the movement specialist. And there are individuals now within American sport. My good friend Rob Gray from Perception Action Podcast with the Boston Red Sox just got hired for a role as a skill acquisition specialist, I think on a part-time level. So at least we do see the tide turning where a movement specialist or a skill acquisition coach or someone that might be under that entire umbrella could start to gain some traction. But I'm here to call out the elephant in the room that this traction isn't being gained quickly enough, and what this role can bring could be game changing. So from Shawn Myszka in 2023 and hopefully beyond, and even though this will probably continue to evolve, I just want to present a theoretical job summary. What an individual who could occupy this movement and skill acquisition specialist role might be responsible for. Ultimately, I believe that it's about assessing and designing practice environments where learning and skill evolution is maximized. And of course, this is intuitively obvious. That is really what practice and training is about, right? But for me, under this problem solver paradigm, which is underpinned or informed by an ecological dynamics perspective or framework, it would be about the setting of alive problems, of tasks for players to interact with, for players to go upon solving in an attempt to facilitate movement skill, which is more transferable. And that movement skill that we're aiming for would be this expression of dexterity. Players chasing dexterity, the ability to solve any emerging movement problem in any situation, in any condition. For me, the movement and skill acquisition specialist should or could almost audit that which what coaches are currently doing across their respective niches in an organization. And I think it's there we can begin to say, how does this fit? How is it what we're doing within our practice or learning environment fit under that which what we know to be true within contemporary skill acquisition? So actually utilizing the ideas that we have found in science and research, or theory for that matter, letting those things, science, research, theory, begin to inform contemporary practice design in a really close, mutual, and reciprocal way to where individuals can sort of check as to how we might be able to modify certain problems to bring more aliveness and to fit within that which what we've actually found within the literature. And so this theoretical job summary then becomes channeled into this theoretical job role where I believe, number one, the sport movement skill acquisition specialist could and should begin to investigate and analyze movement behavior and context, particularly through a more integrated, more contemporary, more ecological lens, with this scope and scale of analysis on the performer-environment relationship. Number two, to adequately begin to determine a player's movement and skill execution gaps and weaknesses. As we know, it's intuitively obvious that this would represent opportunities for players to grow and evolve. Now, again, many position coaches and sport coaches are going to tell you, hey, Shawn, we're already doing that. But what I have found in my experience partnering with NFL players is this really isn't done in an all that individualized or personalized way. That I think that there is still a lot of meat on the bone here for being able to determine a player's gaps and weaknesses within their movement toolbox, how they might be able to move more efficaciously, more functionally, more intentionally at certain times, and how they might be able to connect to the environment and its problems in a little different way. So the information that's present there is able to be, they're able to couple their movements to it. And they're able to interact with different opportunities to act out in the environment and the world differently. Number three, to do this, we need to have a design of more alive, more representative practice activities, which are set or presented to athletes that actually adequately stretches each player to their individualized challenge point. We know by now, it's intuitively obvious that different activities or different problems call for different challenges to different athletes or players, right? And so for me, I think that there's a lot of meat on the bone here as well. This is a ripe opportunity to determine how does this practice activity that we have within our learning environment stretch a player? And how do we actually set up properly an appropriately designed activity, which is specific to the gaps of that player or where it is and what it is that we are asking for him or her to do within the competitive environment. Think about individual periods in the National Football League, which is essentially 10, 12, 15 minutes of rote repetition of everyday drills that one is going to do, which is going to try to impart some sort of way of behaving in one's brain so they can recall it or execute it in a more automatic fashion. But from an ecological perspective, of course, we disregard these types of activities as having really any sort of beneficial role in that which what the player needs to do to solve problems. Again, a huge opportunity in many of the practice activities that I see coaches implementing, not only in the National Football League, but in and across other professional sports. And ultimately, what we're trying to do here, guys and gals, is create a learning environment that's most conducive to channeling authentic and adaptable interactions or problem-solving experiences for players and athletes. And of course, to do that, it isn't a one-man, one-person show, right? We have to have partnerships across an actual organization. So I'm suggesting that the movement and skill acquisition specialist role would be one that would integrate efforts from a skill acquisition, performance analysis, biomechanics, and athletic development and preparation standpoint. Now, this is who knows exactly what department this movement and skill acquisition coach or specialist type of role would fit under. It could be the entire umbrella where they would be more of a department of methodology. It could be such as someone actually working and locking arms really closely with the sport and position coaches. It could be someone who's looked at as a strength and conditioning or player performance professional. You kind of see where I'm going with this. But at the end of the day, I think in order for this type of position to truly be successful, they will need to lock arms with each and every one of these respective departments in the individuals within it. Because the channeling and facilitation of the player's movement skill isn't going to come down to one person preaching from the rooftops as to how things could or should be done. It's going to take all hands on deck, locking the arms in a very closely knit fashion to revamp to modify practice activities and training design in a way that meets players where they are to channel and facilitate those adaptable and authentic problem solving interactions. So, with the sport and position coaches, and now this is going to be just a short synopsis, it could obviously get much, much deeper. But with the sport and position coaches, the movement and skill acquisition specialists could help and enable them to be able to inject more of contemporary skill acquisition methodologies into what they're doing. Some of their traditionally held beliefs may, even though they might have some efficacy, they might be slightly outdated. And I think by injecting just small changes or making small tweaks and manipulations, modifications to what one is doing within a practice or learning environment, the problems that they're setting could increase in aliveness and representativeness, as well as the challenge point that a player is being taken to. So I think it's there that the sport and position coaches, alongside of the movement and skill acquisition specialists, will be vital and integral. And it's intuitively obvious that it would be. We also see it with strength and conditioning and player performance, right? In the NCAA, for example, strength and conditioning is around the players as much, if not more, at certain times of the year as the sport or position coaches will. So there is a lot of room for growth here. A movement and skill acquisition specialist in the strength and conditioning or alongside of the strength and conditioning and player performance staff to show how certain activities might be able to be tweaked and adjusted, just like we would with the sport and position coach. And so I think it's there, like if we even just think about aliveness and agility activity design, as I've talked about here on my YouTube and at Football Beyond the Stats and my team at Emergence, we've talked a lot about aliveness. But strength and conditioning and player performance has a long ways to go for being able to find how to adequately manipulate constraints within their respective training settings. And I think even just the inclusion of certain ideas, repetition without repetition, and really trying to harness variability, what we can do to bring perception action coupling into the mix, differential learning, cueing and guidance and feedback, all of these things which have been studied extensively now within our field in skill acquisition. I think we could have a little bit of evolution in what's happening in strength and conditioning and player performance. Thirdly, there, we could look at sports medicine and the athletic training staffs. If a movement and skill acquisition specialist were to lock arms with them, they might be able to bridge the gap in making the return to player, return to performance process much more seamless as that athlete gets back out into the practice and training environment that exists with the full team, say, for example. So injecting more aliveness there could be vital. Fourthly, with the sports science department and sports scientists really trying to look at the more integrative systems type of approach to investigating and analyzing one sport's performance. So if we were to look at how players are solving problems on the field or on the court or on the rink in their sport, really trying to look at their perceptions, their cognitions, and their actions in this intertwined, interwoven way as to what information they're picking up and what they're doing with it, how they're utilizing that information to channel and guide their actions. Huge room for opportunity here as well. And I think then we can begin to educate or understand what the player's weaknesses might be and how both position coaches as well as player performance departments might be able to attack those gaps and weaknesses for the player, or what we might be able to do with the player to harness their strengths and their skills. Next, the front office. And I'm talking here in regards to talent identification. A big opportunity if we're talking about applying this problem solver paradigm, reframing skill as this functional adaptive relationship between an athlete and their performance environment that has no two problems that are ever the same. I think it's time to abandon some of our traditional ways of identifying talent and instead tweak it, adjust it, and modify some of the things that we're doing to try to capture a player's skill and make that more contemporary as well. So we might find that if we were to have someone whose job is solely oriented around viewing movement and skill behavior in this way, talent identification might change. And finally, and arguably most importantly, the athletes themselves. All too often, the athletes are along for the ride in the practice and training tasks, right? They didn't have any say as to what practice or training tasks they might be participating in that they believe will actually have efficacy to what they do and how they do it in the competitive performance environment. And I believe, as my friend Tyler Yerby would say, we have to invite the athlete to their own party and give them ownership, give them autonomy. We might find increased engagement if we include the player in a little different way. And I believe that here, the movement and skill acquisition specialist could have a major role in this, sitting down with the player and watching their film and determining what it is that they see from themselves, how it is that they are viewing the movement problems in their world, and how their own form of life serves as this conduit, as their vehicle to how they interact in solving these problems. We must give the ownership over to the athlete, and the movement and skill acquisition specialist might be able to prioritize the athlete and their perspective, the creating an authentic individual that is the athlete back in the practice and learning environment. And as we wind down here, we have to remember that it's all hands on deck when it comes to facilitating skill. What we're after for the players is to chase and express dexterity. That means they must become more tuned, more intentional, and more adaptable. This is what skill is about in this new contemporary way of capturing skill. But in order to do that, coaches or coaching practitioners in any professional in the organization must become more tuned, intentional, and adaptable themselves. So the movement and skill acquisition specialists, in order for them to be highly successful, they must come into a place where they're not a giver of truth, as Bruce Lee would say, but instead they're a pointer to that truth where each and every individual might be able to find that truth for themselves. They might be able to explore themselves, their practice environment for the coach, the athlete in their problem solving in a little different way. And it will require all of us to be constantly changing and constantly adaptable in this. And I believe that the movement and skill acquisition specialists and inclusion and hiring of those types of individuals actually represents this constantly changing, constantly adapting next step in sport performance. Now, of course, I tried to cram a lot in there in a relatively short period of time. I apologize if I got a little long-winded. If you want to interact around these ideas, I would certainly advise you or encourage you, implore you to reach out to me. My first thing on top there is my Twitter handle at Movement Miyagi. And you can also reach me at my email, Shawn@optimizemovement.com or Shawn@emergentmovement.com. I would love to interact with anyone and everyone across American professional sports about this respective idea. I believe that the first person in the first group, the first organization that really takes hold with this idea and puts it to use, goes all in with it, and allows someone who's highly skillful to be able to interact in this way, can and will not only change the trajectory and the success of their respective organization, but also the entire performance landscape in their sport.